All right, in this lecture, I want to conclude uh, my discussion of responses to capitalism in the Gilded Age. You'll recall the first two responses were the idea of the self-made man and the idea of social Darwinism. The third and final idea, in an attempt to reconcile American values and Americans' comfort with the gross excessive wealth of corporate capitalism, is called the gospel of wealth. Um, and Andrew Carnegie, who was a big proponent of social Darwinism, by the way, he wrote an article titled The Gospel of Wealth in 1889. And in some ways, it was an attempt to soften the harsh edges of social Darwinism. It claimed that people of great wealth have great responsibilities, and they must use their wealth to advance social progress. Hence, Carnegie's very great philanthropy. He spent the last part of his life giving away his fortune. In 1901, he sold his company, the Carnegie Steel Company, to John Pierpont Morgan for $480 million, a huge fortune at that time. Morgan assembled it with some other companies into something called U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation. Anyway, Carnegie takes his money and begins giving it away to things like libraries. He's trying to give money to people in ways that will help them help themselves. And he was truly a great philanthropist. I've put a picture here of Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. They are the two richest men in America's day, and coincidentally, they have combined their great wealth into one foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which now is busy giving away their $100 billion. So I think they are really descendants of this idea of Carnegie, and this is an American idea that to whom much is given, much is required. And so it makes great wealth a little more acceptable. Related to Carnegie's ideas about the gospel of wealth uh, were kind of a related idea that the American economy offered wealth to anyone who really wanted it. There was a guy named Russell Conwell. He was a Baptist minister, and he was famous for his Acres of Diamonds speech. And he became a millionaire himself, traveling around the country and charging to deliver this speech. And also, he published it as a little book. And here's an excerpt from his speech, so you'll get the idea. I say you ought to get rich. It is your duty to get rich. How many of my pious brethren say to me, do you, a Christian minister, spend your time going up and down the country advising young people to get rich, to get money? Yes, of course I do. They say, isn't that awful? Why don't you preach the gospel instead of preaching about man's making money? Because to make money honestly is to preach the gospel. That is the reason. The men who get rich may be the most honest men you find in the community. You get the idea. Um, Related to this, I think, this is this prosperity gospel, prosperity theology has been very popular in America. And there's a guy today, probably the best example of this, a guy named Creflo Dollar. He's a televangelist, has a huge church in Atlanta, and he believes that you should be rich. The prosperity gospel basically says wealth is God's will for His followers. And Creflo Dollar has two Rolls Royces and a private jet and a mansion, and he believes that his wealth is a sign of God's favor, and that if you do what is right in God's sight and give money to His church, then God will make you materially wealthy. Um, some of you may be thinking, isn't this completely contrary to the rather radical things that Jesus preached about wealth? And I would say yes, but again, people are trying to reconcile their Christian values uh, and their American values with the existence of great wealth. Now, not everyone in America was applauding corporate capitalism and trying to think up ways to feel better about it. There were alternative visions. One of them was held by the sociologist Lester Frank Ward, who was a Darwinist, but rejected the application of Darwin's ideas to human society. He wrote a book in 1883 called Dynamic Sociology, and it said that civilization is governed by human intelligence, which can shape society as it wishes. There's no natural law, invisible hand, forcing us to accept all these things. Unlike Sumner, He felt that government engaged in positive planning was society's best hope. Very reasonable, moderate vision. Others opposed to laissez-faire and social Darwinism were more strident, more militant. The Socialist Labor Party was founded by Daniel De Leon in the 1870s. I like what this quote here. Socialism is that social system under which the necessaries of production are owned, controlled, and administered by the people, for the people, and under which accordingly the cause of political and economic despotism having been abolished, class rule is at an end. That is socialism, nothing short of that. So that's a much more militant response to capitalism. And that's an example of Marxist thought, which is so important, such an important, perhaps the most important alternative response to capitalism, that we'll save that for a whole another lecture later. Another alternative vision was that of Henry George, who wrote a book called Progress and Poverty in 1879. It was a huge success. Similar idea to those of Daniel De Leon, but milder. He claimed that the rich get wealthy from the growth of society, so they should be taxed to return their incremental wealth back to society at large. We should tax the rich moderately for the betterment of society, which, after all, is providing their wealth. He was almost elected mayor of New York. He was a much more popular and acceptable politician than was Daniel De Leon. Also popular was the vision of Edward Bellamy, who wrote the utopian novel Looking Backward in 1888. I cannot tell you how, we've forgotten about him today, but Looking Backward was, I can't tell you how popular it was. It sold 1 million copies in the Gilded Age. It's rather astounding. And basically in it, a person from the 1880s wakes up in the year 2000 to find a utopian society in which all trust have become one giant trust. The steel trust, the railroad trust, they've all merged together, and this giant trust redistributes all wealth. There is no poverty. There are no social programs. Government has withered away because of everyone's total cooperation. Didn't quite work out that way. Finally, I want to point out these few people, Bellamy, Ward, De Leon, they questioned capitalism itself, perhaps in some ways, but very few people did. But a lot of people questioned monopoly. All kinds of people did so. They blamed monopolies for high prices and for economic instability. The Gilded Age was a time of booms and busts, increasingly severe recessions, one of the worst occurring in 1893. So everyone largely, except the monopolist, were concerned about monopoly. And the visibility of grotesque luxury aggravated this concern. This woman, Mrs. Bradley Martin, she rather infamously hosted a ball, a party, in which she spent $9 million in today's money, where everyone was supposed to come dressed as Renaissance royalty. This is a picture of her as Mary Queen of Scots. And basically, public anger, and for some reason news of this party got out and it was widely reported in the press, and public anger and higher taxes based on that anger prompted her and her husband to flee to England. But they had a couple of estates there, so no worries. Bottom line is the standard of living was rising for all, but the gap between rich and poor was widening. There was increasing stratification of wealth, just like it is today in China, and this was a great concern.